The gymnasium on Rosecrans Avenue in Torrance, California sat low and plain beneath a winter sky in January of 1968. It was 11 in the morning. Outside, a gardener was trimming the edge of a neighbor's lawn with slow, unhurried passes. A delivery truck idled at the corner. The world was doing what the world does, moving through its routine without ceremony. Without any awareness that something was about to happen inside that building that men would still be talking about 57 years later. Inside, the smell was familiar to anyone who had spent serious time in a serious gym. Floor wax and canvas, and the faint iron smell of men who had been working since early morning. The fluorescent lights ran in 2 rows across the ceiling and threw a flat, colorless light onto the mat below. There were 11 people in the room. 4 were seated on a wooden bench along the south wall. 3 stood near the far corner with their arms crossed. 2 more leaned against a stack of folded training mats. 1 stood at the doorway between the gymnasium and the back office, holding a clipboard he had forgotten to use. The 11th man sat in a folding chair near the center of the room, his back straight, his hands resting open on his knees. His name, if anyone had thought to ask, was Chuck Norris. He was 27 years old. He weighed 171 pounds. He was 5 feet 10 inches tall. He was wearing a white t-shirt and a pair of ordinary dark trousers. He had arrived without fanfare and sat down without ceremony. He looked like a man who had come to observe. Across the mat, a 26-year-old with a build that stopped every conversation in a room stood watching the warm-up drills with an attention so precise it felt like measurement. His name needs no introduction in any language. Bruce Lee. Born November 27, 1940, by the winter of 1968 he had spent the better part of 2 decades reshaping the way the world thought about martial arts. He had trained under Ip Man. He had fought in the streets of Hong Kong as a teenager and won. He had competed and instructed across 2 continents. He had developed a personal fighting philosophy, Jeet Kune Do, that no existing school or system contained. He had studied boxing footage until the reels wore thin. He moved at speeds that observers consistently described not in terms of motion but in terms of absence. He was simply not where he had been. And then, he was somewhere else. He stood 5 feet 7 inches tall and weighed 135 pounds on a morning when he had eaten well. Every ounce of it was deliberate. In the next 8 seconds, something would happen on that mat that Bruce Lee did not expect. And nobody in that room, not the man with the clipboard, not the 4 on the bench, not the 3 in the corner, nobody knew they were about to witness the moment that would change both of these men for the rest of their lives. Stay with this, it is worth staying for. Bruce Lee had arrived at the gymnasium on Rosecrans Avenue that January with a specific purpose. He had been conducting what could only be described as a private audit, visiting schools, gyms and dojos across Southern California. Observing fighters he had not yet observed, measuring systems he had not yet measured. He was not arrogant in the common sense of that word. Arrogance suggests a man who has not bothered to check. Bruce Lee had checked everything. He had checked and found most things wanting. What looked, from the outside, like dismissal was actually the conclusion of a rigorous process. He had done the math and was walking around with the answer. He had heard about Chuck Norris. The name was known in competition circles with the particular weight that comes not from publicity, but from repetition. Men who fought in tournaments mentioned the name with a careful neutrality that was itself a form of respect. 2-time world middleweight karate champion. A competitor whose record in point karate over the preceding 3 years had become something of a problem for people trying to build a bracket. He had not simply won. He had won in a way that discouraged challengers at the registration stage. His technique in the Tang Sudo system was clean and fast and placed with an economy of motion that tournament officials noticed, and students copied poorly. But Bruce Lee had developed a specific skepticism about point karate that was not personal and not unfair. He had articulated it in private seminars, and in correspondence, and in conversations that his students remembered word for word decades later. Point karate, he believed, had developed in a particular direction, toward the score, toward the judge, toward the controlled environment, and in doing so had moved away from something he considered essential, real timing. The timing of a man who is not pausing to wait for a point to be called. The timing of a man for whom there is no judge, no pause, no restart from fighting distance. He respected the training. He questioned the transfer. He had come to Torrance to see for himself. The warm-up had been running for 40 minutes when Bruce Lee approached the center of the mat. The 11 people in the room had been watching him since his arrival with the particular attention that gathers around men who generate it without effort. He had said very little. He had watched the drilling sequences with the expression of a man reading a text in a language he knows well enough to notice errors. Then he had said 5 words. "Let us see your timing." It was not an insult in the conventional sense. It was not delivered with theater or with an audience in mind. He had simply stated what he wanted. But the 5 words landed in the room with a weight that made 2 of the 4 men on the bench exchange a glance they would each remember independently for the next 40 years. Chuck Norris stood up from the folding chair. He moved without hurry. He reached down and picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. He folded it once along the center seam. He set it across the seat of the chair. He straightened and turned toward the center of the mat and walked toward it with the measured pace of a man who has already decided something that the people around him have not yet been informed of. He stopped 7 feet from Bruce Lee and waited. The room went quiet in a specific way, not the quiet of an empty space, the quiet of a full space that has chosen to hold its breath. The man with the clipboard set it down on the stack of folded mats. The 3 men in the corner uncrossed their arms. The delivery truck outside had moved on. The gardener had stopped. The world outside continued, but the world outside had become irrelevant. He has already lost. He just does not know it yet. That sentence did not belong to Chuck Norris. He was not the kind of man who organized his thoughts around phrases. He was the kind of man who stood 7 feet from the greatest martial artist alive and waited for what came next with the particular stillness of someone who has stood in difficult places before and found that stillness was the correct response. The recognition moved through the room like a current finding its path. The man in the doorway between the gymnasium and the back office looked up from his clipboard and saw what was happening on the mat and understood, in a way that required no explanation, that he was watching something he would tell people about. The 4 on the bench sat forward in unison, one of the 3 men in the corner. A judo competitor from Inglewood named David Park, who had been training competitively for 11 years, would say afterward that the hair on his forearms had risen before a single technique was thrown. If you want to find out what happened in those 8 seconds, make sure you are subscribed and drop a comment telling us where in the world you are watching from right now. The distance between them was 7 feet. Bruce Lee understood distance with a precision that was almost architectural. He had spent years studying the geometry of a fight, the angles, the reach differentials, the windows that opened and closed in fractions of a second. 7 feet was, for most fighters in that era, a neutral distance. Far enough to feel safe, close enough to close. It was the distance at which many fighters made their first and most consequential mistake. The mistake of believing they understood what they were looking at. A fight is not 2 men moving toward each other. A fight is a continuous conversation about space. And the first man to speak in a language the other man does not know has already said everything important. Bruce Lee initiated. What he threw was not a probing technique. It was not a read. It was the technique, the combination he had refined to a single, devastating instrument. The lead hand flicked forward with a speed that one of the men on the bench would later describe as the absence of beginning. There was no preparatory motion. There was no chambering, no shoulder load, no shift in weight that preceded it. It was simply there, and then it was coming. Second one. Chuck Norris moved 3 inches to the outside line, not back, not away, to the side, and slightly forward. The distance between them, which had been 7 feet, became 4. The lead hand passed through empty air. The man with the clipboard standing in the doorway did not breathe. Second 2, Bruce Lee adjusted. This was what separated him from everyone who had come before, the adjustment. He did not commit and recover. He read the response and reconfigured in the same motion, as if the first technique and the second were a single thought. The rear hand followed the first with a trajectory that accounted for the 3-inch movement. It was a correction calculated at a speed that should not have been calculable. Chuck Norris slipped it, not blocked, not parried. Slipped. The distinction matters, and the men in the room who knew enough to make it, made it immediately and in silence. A block acknowledges the technique, a parry redirects it. A slip means the technique arrives at the place where a man was, and finds only air. And the man is now somewhere else, in a position from which the geometry of the exchange has changed entirely. David Park, standing in the corner of the gymnasium with his arms no longer crossed, leaned forward 1 inch. Second 3, the distance between them was now 3.5 feet. This was the range at which Bruce Lee was arguably the most dangerous man alive. He operated in the pocket with a comfort that fighters who were accustomed to working from further out found genuinely disorienting. He generated power at ranges where other men could not, through a combination of hip rotation, structure, and a timing so refined it had no equivalent in any system then being taught in the United States. He fired from that range. The combination was compact and precise and arrived in 2 beats where most fighters would have needed 4. The first technique was targeted to the body. The second, contingent on the first, was targeted above it. Chuck Norris covered. His arms came together in a configuration that was not standard in any system Bruce Lee had studied in California. It was not a wing block. It was not a cross-arm cover. It was something assembled from Tang So Do structure and modified by years of competition experience into something that fit specifically the problem of a very fast, very short-range combination delivered by a man who did not telegraph. It absorbed the pressure without absorbing the full force. It moved with the technique rather than against it. Bruce Lee's second technique grazed the outside of the forearm and missed its intended destination by 6 inches. The man on the bench nearest the door stood up without realizing he had done so. He stood there for 3 seconds, did not sit back down and remained standing for the rest of what followed. Second 4. A pause. Not a long pause. In the language of ordinary time, it was not a pause at all. It was perhaps 3/4 of a second. But 47 seconds of real fighting between 2 men who know what they are doing is a different kind of 47 seconds than 47 seconds of anything else. And 3/4 of a second inside that kind of time contains a complete exchange of information. Bruce Lee read what he had gathered. He was reading the distance management. He was reading the slip. He was reading the cover. He was assembling a picture of a man who had in the first 3.5 seconds of an exchange declined to be where he was supposed to be twice, and then declined to be hurt when being where he was supposed to be might have led to it. He did not recalibrate with urgency. He recalibrated with interest. Second 5. What came next was not a continuation of the previous combination. It was a different question entirely. Bruce Lee stepped at an angle, not straight in, not back, but at 45 degrees to his own center line, and threw from the new position with a lead hand technique that was not directed at the head or the body, but at the space just in front of the face. A technique designed not to land but to produce a specific response, a flinch, a shift, an opening of the line that the rear hand would then address with full commitment. Chuck Norris did not flinch. He stood in place. He let the lead hand arrive where it arrived. And in the quarter-second window that the technique produced, the window that had been designed to create the opening, he was not in the opening. He had closed it before it was offered. David Park, in the corner, exhaled through his nose in a sound that was not quite a word, but carried the semantic content of one. Second 6. The room had stopped performing its ordinary functions. The 4 men on the bench were all forward now, elbows on knees, weight on the front of their feet. The 3 in the corner were no longer 3 separate individuals but a single attentive surface. The man in the doorway had put his hand on the doorframe without knowing why. Chuck Norris had been in 4 feet of Bruce Lee's space for 5 seconds. In 5 seconds at 4 feet from Bruce Lee, a man received information. Chuck Norris had received it, he held it, and then he did something that no one in that room had seen anyone do in that position before. He stepped into the remaining distance, not with a technique, not with a combination. He stepped into a range of 18 inches and placed his weight in a particular way and stood there. He was offering his own read. Second 7. Bruce Lee saw it. He saw what was being offered. He saw the weight placement and the particular angle of the shoulder, and he understood, in the way that only a man of his comprehension could understand it, that he was being shown something. Not challenged, not countered. Shown. A second passed in which neither man moved. It was the longest second in the room. Second 8. Chuck Norris raised his left hand, not to strike. He raised it to the level of his shoulder with the palm open and turned outward. A gesture so specific in its context that it required no translation for anyone present who had ever stood on a mat and understood what it meant. It meant, I have seen enough of you. I think you have seen enough of me. Let us acknowledge what this is. Bruce Lee looked at the open palm. He looked at the man behind it. He stood at 18 inches from a man who had, in 8 seconds, declined to be hit twice, declined to be led once, and then stepped forward to offer rather than demand. He stood there for a moment that several of the 11 witnesses would later describe, independently and without coordination, as the longest moment they had ever watched from the outside of. Then Bruce Lee did something that Bruce Lee almost never did. He laughed. Not the laugh of a man who has won. Not the laugh of a man who has been surprised by something small. It was the laugh of a man who has been looking for something for a long time and has abruptly, unexpectedly found it in a place he did not think to look. He extended his own right hand. Chuck Norris took it. The man on the bench who had stood up sat back down and looked at the floor for a moment. David Park, in the corner, put his hands in his pockets and looked at the ceiling. The man in the doorway with the clipboard picked the clipboard up and looked at it and put it back down. The gymnasium on Rosecrans Avenue held its new quiet for 4 more seconds. Then the traffic outside resumed its ordinary meaning. The light continued falling on the floor in the same indifferent way it had been falling all morning. Somewhere down the block a phone rang in an empty office. What Bruce Lee said was not said to the room. It was said at a distance of 18 inches to a man who had just demonstrated, in 8 seconds, something that Bruce Lee had spent considerable time concluding was uncommon. The words were quiet. They were not delivered with theater. They were delivered with the specific weight of a man who does not give assessments carelessly. What he said was, "You cover differently than anyone I have worked with. I want to understand that." It was not an apology. Bruce Lee was not a man who organized his exchanges around apology. It was something rarer, a genuine question from a man who had believed, with evidence that he had already gathered the relevant data, and who had been shown in 8 seconds that the data set was incomplete. Chuck Norris did not answer immediately. When he did, he said 4 words, "Come back on Thursday." The fork in the road that the story offers does not belong to Chuck Norris. He had no apology to make and no excuse to reach for. The fork belonged to the moment itself. Bruce Lee could have received the 8 seconds as an anomaly. A single exchange with insufficient data, the kind of result that competition fighters sometimes produce when a format suits them specifically. He could have filed it under luck of distance and moved on. He did not. He came back on Thursday. And then the Thursday after that. What began in 8 seconds on a January morning in a gymnasium on Rosecrans Avenue in Torrance, California became one of the most consequential training relationships in the history of martial arts in the 20th century. Bruce Lee incorporated elements of Chuck Norris's kicking structure into his own study of fighting mechanics. Chuck Norris absorbed from Bruce Lee a philosophy of system design, the question of why a thing works, not just the fact that it does, that reshaped the way he thought about his own training and eventually about the schools he would go on to build, and the art he would go on to create. The man on the bench told the story. David Park told it in the corner of 3 different dojos over the next decade, and the story moved the way these stories move, carried by the people who witnessed it outward through the community, arriving in gyms in San Francisco and Phoenix and Dallas and London, in forms that had changed in the details but not in the shape. Some versions gave it a different venue. Some versions gave it a different duration. Some versions added a technique that was not thrown and a result that did not occur. The story grew where stories grow and shed details that did not survive the telling. But the shape of it held. The shape of it was, 2 men stood on a mat, and one of them expected one thing and the other showed him something else. And the respect that followed was real and lasting, and not performed. A man who knew Bruce Lee well, a student who had trained with him for 3 years by 1970, said that he heard Bruce Lee refer to Chuck Norris in a specific way on more than one occasion. He referred to him in the particular vocabulary he used for fighters he considered genuinely worth the word. As someone who had answers he had not been asked, it was the highest register of what Bruce Lee gave to a fighter. It was reserved for the small group of men he considered not just competent but genuinely interesting. Chuck Norris never told this story in interviews. He was not constitutionally suited to the kind of storytelling that puts himself at the center of an exchange with a man he considered a friend. He spoke of Bruce Lee with the careful respect of someone for whom the subject was not material for conversation, but something closer to private. When he was asked about their training together, he answered in the way he answered most questions about the interior of things, with enough to satisfy the question, and not enough to fill the silence on the other side of it. The gymnasium on Rosecrans Avenue no longer exists in the form it existed that January morning. The light that fell on the floor that day has been replaced by every light that came after it. The 11 people in the room have moved through the decades in the directions that decades move people. David Park became a respected instructor. The man in the doorway with the clipboard left the martial arts community entirely and managed a hardware business in Oxnard for 30 years. The 4 men on the bench scattered across the map of a country that was itself changing rapidly in the years that followed. But the 8 seconds stayed with all of them in the specific way that witnessed moments stay, not as memory exactly, but as something closer to a permanent alteration of what a person understands to be possible. When you watch 2 people of that quality exchange information at that speed and at that range, you do not simply remember it, you carry it as a recalibration of what competence can look like when it is applied, without vanity, without performance, and without the need to be seen doing it. The lesson of that January morning is not about technique. Technique is what was thrown and slipped and covered and offered. The lesson is about the posture a person brings to the experience of encountering something they do not fully understand. Bruce Lee was, by any measure that existed in 1968, one of the 2 or 3 most knowledgeable human beings alive on the subject of unarmed fighting. He had the right to walk into that gymnasium and find whatever he was looking for and leave with his conclusions intact. He had done that work. He had earned that certainty, and he chose not to use it. He chose, in 8 seconds, to let the information that was being offered be the information that it actually was, rather than the information he had expected to gather. He came back on Thursday. He asked the question. He listened to the answer. A man who knows a great deal about something and is willing to still be taught by it is not a man who has failed. He is a man who has understood the most difficult thing that knowledge makes available, that it is not a destination but a direction, and that the direction requires continuous movement. The story a man tells himself about what he already knows is often the only obstacle between him and what he could know next. Next time, we will tell the story of the day in 1979 when Steve McQueen walked into a private training session in Bel Air and told the man running it that he had nothing left to learn, and what the man running it showed him in the following 11 minutes that changed his mind permanently. Make sure you are subscribed so you do not miss it.